Okay, so I will give up the podium, and let's invite Professor Melton Hirshman to come.
Are you chairing?
Yeah, I'm chair.
All right, so you just come up here. Matt, you come
I'm
up
a
here.
minimalist chair.
Yeah.
So here's the deal. We have run over our introductions time by 10 minutes already. I think that means that each of these talks, of which there are 4, is going to have to be about 20 minutes. Here's Professor Marc Hirshman, Hebrew University of Jerusalem.
He said Marc.
Speech and silence, religious education, late antiquity.
Matt and Nathan, can I invite you to come up here, please?
Is there a particular reason not to? Oh, it's because it's recorded?
Yes.
Yeah, right.
I think I could do my job from here. They don't need me.
The recording thing is up
You
here.
want me to sit here or
Don't wait. Don't wait.
sit right here?
Or stand if you
Also,
wish.
formality is
He'll
underrated.
hold up big signs.
Whatever's best for you.
Give me a couple of mics.
Is this the same?
Huh?
It's just
He
one
said,
page,
he
right?
said sit or stand, whichever you prefer.
It's
Just one page.
Huh?
One sheet, right?
One sheet,
One
two
sheet.
seconds.
One sheet.
I only got 15 minutes. Okay. So you want me to stand?
Whatever's best for you.
Nothing is good. Okay. 2 things to start with. Traditionally, when people come from abroad, we say, Achenu v'achiotenu batem lishalom. That's what they used to say with the Bikurim. So I hope you had good travel, and we're happy to have you here. I'm sure you're happy to be here. The title was a lecture I gave in Rome 2 months ago. And most of the research I did for that, and then half of it is that, and half of it's new. There's too much for one lecture anyway. Then I found, after I gave this lecture, and then I am giving a course on this now, that Alon Goshen Gladstein had given almost the same title to something about Chassidut. I haven't read it yet, but I wrote him a note saying what a great title he had picked. Okay, so here we go. I'll try to do it pretty quick. The psalmist says, "For thee silence is praise." Of course, if I were to heed this psalm, I would stop here. Indeed, one of the early rabbinic sages, Shimon, as you will all know, rather than on the Gamaliel Council, all my days I have grown up or apprenticed among the wise, and I find nothing better for the body, the person, than silence. I want to explore with you the various modalities and practices of education in late antique Judaism and Christianity, ranging from strict silence to incessant repetition, sometimes accompanied by a tune or a chant. Now, all of you know this, so I'll do it quickly. For a proper understanding of rabbinic education, it's important to emphasize that the Jewish sages' insistence on orality as the almost exclusive means of transmitting their Torah over the first 500 years of the Common Era. Though Holy Scripture was read liturgically from scrolls, written documents were prohibited in the rabbinic study circles, which eventually evolved into full-fledged academies in the latter half of the 500 years. In educational settings outside of the ritual reading, Scripture was cited by heart. Rabbinic law and exegesis was an oral affair, transmitted from teacher to student. Now, there is some exception here about books of Agadah, but we won't go into that now. This was so much so the case of rabbinic literature reports a lovely custom, of the rabbis going to visit communities where sages had passed away in order to collect and recover that sage's traditions, lest they perish with the sage. Rabbi Eliezer, over the Talmud reports, Rabbi Eliezer dismay over the many traditions he possessed was unable to transmit to his students, and so on and so forth. I think the most radical formulation of this is the Tosefta in Shabbat, which also means, maybe Michael could talk about it, those who write down blessings are like those who burn the Torah, right? Kotvei brachot kisorfei Torah. Okay, so now let's begin. Given our introduction, 2 very poignant sources on early rabbinic education are preserved in the Tosefta, that great mid-3rd century compilation of oral law which evolved eventually into a supplementary corpus to the widely accepted and studied Mishnah. Tosefta was quite likely originally an authoritative corpus in its own right, but has come down to us as an early supplement. Surprisingly, our starting point begins with the Para Aduma, the red heifer, which is found in the Hebrew Bible at Numbers chapter 14. The purpose of this intricate rite, you remember, was to purify those who had become impure due to contact with a corpse. Read this very striking text at Tosefta Para. English or Hebrew? You have any preferences? Both are in front of you. I'll do it in Hebrew, you read the English. You see mitzvata ba'arba bigdei lavan, the Tosefta says. That's not in English. You remember the simple Kohen. The ordinary Kohen had 4 garments called bigdei lavan, white, and the high priest had the golden garments. And the question is, which was the proper ritual for the burning of the red cow, which happened outside the temple precinct, so it's a little complicated. Shahu Talmidei Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, para b'ma na'aseit, אמר להם בבגדי זהב, אמרו לו ליבנתנו בבגדי לבן, אמר להם יפה אמרתם, ומעשה שעשו ידיי וראו עיניי ושכחתי, וכששמעו אוזניי על אחת כמה וכמה. עכשיו התוספתא אז, לא שלא היה יודע, אלא שהיה מבקש לזרז את התלמידים. Tosefta does not want to think that he really forgot the ritual. And so now we'll talk about it in a minute. And some say it was Hillel who was the hero here and not Rabbi Yochanan. But the continuation is more interesting even. Shehaya Rabbi Yehoshua Omer, Hashoneh ve'ino amel, ki ish zoreah v'lo kotzer. Haramei Torah v'shachea, domeh l'isha hayoledet, chavila v'koveret. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Zamer bi Tadira Zamer, or Zemer bi Tadira. It's not clear. Okay, let's talk about this terrific text. This source is everything, from alleged pedagogic dissembling to the shocking metaphor of Rabbi Joshua. Forgetting one's learning is likened to a stillbirth. It ends on the high note of Rabbi Akiva, encouraging constant singing of oral Torah. It is very important to note that we have here also a stellar chain of tradition, beginning with the formidable Rabbi Yochanan, and continuing with Rabbi Joshua, his student, and finally with that towering figure of rabbinic Tanaim, Rabbi Akiva. We will spend some time on a close reading of this foundational text for our topic. Tradition has it that this ritual was carried out only 7 times, the red heifer, in Second Temple time, from Moses through Mishnah times. It is therefore not surprising that this fairly arcane ritual is recollected by Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai with some difficulty, in spite of the fact that he claims to have witnessed one of these ceremonies. According to Scripture, this ritual purified those defiled. This paradox was viewed of defiling the pure and imparting purity to the defiled, was viewed as one of the great ritual paradoxes which, according to rabbinic legend, even Solomon, the wisest of human beings, couldn't understand. As an aside, we know that this biblical law and ceremony of the red cow left such a lasting impression that the second surah of the Quran mentions it, and it gave its name to the entire surah, which is called the cow. The question addressed to the teacher in our source is whether the priest performing the ceremony is to be dressed in the simple white clothes of this common priest or the golden garments of the high priest. Menachem Kanan's forthcoming commentary on the Midrash, the Sifrei, points to an exegesis in the Second Temple Qumranic literature, which addresses this very issue, meaning that it certainly might have been a hotly disputed issue for over a century before Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan opts first for the golden garments of the high priest, immediately being challenged by his students. He changes his decision to the simple white garments of the common priest. Let's leave aside the question of why the students asked in the first place, if they already knew the right answer. It is clear that Rabbi Yochanan used the occasion to impress upon his students that even personal experience does not vouchsafe accurate memory. Hearing, which was the crucial sense employed in receiving teaching, was in this view extremely susceptible to the vicissitudes of memory. From this source we deduce that hearing was the pivotal instrument in teaching, not reading, of course. Was this temporary lapse of memory staged by Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai as the anonymous voice of the Tosefta would have it? Or was this a real lapse? This is difficult to pin down, but the object lesson of the constant need for remembering is forcefully asserted. But it's Rabbi Yochanan's student, Rabbi Joshua, who reinforces the teacher's lesson by formulating it as a pithy two-part simile. He who learns recites, but does not labor, is as a man who sows, but does not reap. Labor here, it would seem, is the effort and toil one is to invest in fully understanding the material that has been memorized. But I'm not sure about that. But the second simile supplies an ominous warning, recasting his teacher's cautionary note in dire terms. He who learns Torah and forgets is like a woman who gives birth and berries. Losing Torah by forgetfulness entails the same sense of loss in one what hopes was a rhetorical hyperbole as the loss of an infant. Both the sages discussed up and down were seminal figures in their generations. But arguably it's Rabbi Akiva who is the ultimate representative of the oral Torah, and I skip things you already know. Rabbi Akiva says, Zamer bi tadira zamer. The word zamer can be rendered either as a nominative or a verbal form, and I won't go into the whole thing, I'll just translate it, sing me always, sing. But what did he mean? Rabbi Akiva's dictum has generally been understood to be a technique to enhance memorization. This technique was widespread in schools of rhetoric and elsewhere in late antiquity, harking back to much earlier sources. There's a suggestive, though hardly conclusive support to this, in Syriac Christianity's linking of the role of the choir master and the exegete, as demonstrated by Adam Becker in his learned work, The School of Nisibis, and the Development of Scholastic Culture, a great book. But we could do well to note the marked change in tone of Rabbi Akiva's dictum from those of his teachers. Both in Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Joshua's exhortations, there's an urgent plea and a dread of the attrition of oral Torah through forgetfulness. Rabbi Akiva's statement is brimming with confidence, and bespeaks a new and more optimistic ambience. The third rabbinic generation after the destruction has successfully regenerated oral Torah. I go into something now about Rabbi Akiva and singing and love thy Torah, but we don't have time for that. Let's skip on to the next part. One is, according to Rabbi Akiva, to encourage chant all of one's learning. But, accepting Song of Songs, that's for another time. Chanting one's learning became so important, and I'm getting the handout too, that Rabbi Yochanan Nafka, the greatest sage of the land of Israel in Talmudic times, built on Rabbi Akiva's approach and advanced the following bold exegesis of Ezekiel 20. I also gave them statutes that were not good and ordinances by which they could not live. And Rabbi Shefatia said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, one who reads scripture without a chant and recites Mishnah without a song, scripture says about him, I also gave them statutes that were not good and ordinances by which they could not live. Rabbi Yochanan claims that the study must have a musical component to it. Otherwise, the laws and commandments lose their vitality and goodness. Rabbi Yochanan's statement is challenged a century or more later in the Babylonian Talmud on the grounds that how can vocal acumen determine the quality of scholarship? I would be in trouble if it did. This objection was raised by Rabbi Misharsha, a 5th century Babylonian, and might have influenced practice. But I'm assured by our Professor Baruch Schwartz here at the School of Education, who's doing a lot of studying of the dynamics of yeshiva learning and Mir Yeshiva, that contemporary learning remains, is accompanied by prosody. So Rabbi Shvatya, Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Akiva won out. Let's look at one final Talmudic source and we'll move on to silence. Do I have time for silence? How was that good?
About 5 minutes.
5 minutes. I won't do the number source number 3 because they've cut us down here. It's one of my favorite texts in the Talmud.
Then you probably should do it. Do it.
No, I prefer to be silent. You'll read it on your own. We skip to silence. I move on to silence. It's quite clear. For rabbis, learning was talking. And for Rabbi Akiva, he added a singing dimension. There's a lot to be said about how in rhetoric there was a difference between singing and speaking and which was better. That's not for here. So now I move on to silence. In his powerful commentary on Ecclesiastes, composed around 390, a few kilometers down in Bethlehem, the erudite church father Jerome writes the following on a time to be silent and a time to speak. That should be number 4. I suppose this is from this passage, a time to be silent, that the Pythagoreans drew the origin of their rule. Their training is to observe 5 years without speaking, and to speak only then after receiving education. So let us learn not to talk. And so that we may open our mouths to talk later on. Let us for a certain time say nothing, and attend to our instructor's discourse. Let nothing seem right to us but what we are learning, so that after long silence we may be made into teachers instead of pupils. Now I come back to Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. Kol yamai gadalti. All my days I apprenticed. I want to read this. Gadalti Eitzel is certainly apprenticed. Maybe Gadalti Ben is also among the sages, and I found silence to be the only thing good for the body. Midrash is not the main thing, but the deed, one who increases words, brings sin. So the first and the third are very similar. Shimon advocates action over study, silence over speech. The great medieval commentaries on Avot, Magid Avot and Rabbi Shimon ben Semach Duran, foremost among them, generally applied these dicta on silence to caution against harmful or banal speech. When applied to education, Duran interprets Rabbi Shimon's call for silence as addressed to students, just like Jerome, to be silent before their teachers. Would we want that? Or teachers to teach as briefly as possible. Rabbi Yosef Nachmias connected the demand for silence with Avot 5:7. 7 things that mark a wise person. The first 3 are: a wise person does not speak before someone greater, does not interrupt his friend's speech, is not precipitous in his reply. All this finds a wonderful parallel to Plutarch, born around 40, in his terrific essay on listening to lectures, and I'll close with that just for lack of time. I didn't give you Plutarch because I didn't have the Latin, so I didn't want to cheat here. Here we go. Here comes some English. Therefore, since listening to lectures, this is a good opener for me. Therefore, since listening to lectures is attended by great benefit, one hopes, but by no less danger to the young, I think it's a good thing to discuss the matter continually, both with oneself and with another. The reason for this is because we observe that a poor use is made of the great majority of persons who practice speaking before they have acquired the habit of listening. They think that there must be study and practice in discourse, but as for hearing, benefit will come however it's used. It is true that in the case of people playing ball, learning to throw and learning to catch take place at the same time. But in the use of discourse, its proper reception comes before its delivery, just as conception and pregnancy come before delivery. As skillful horse trainers give the horse with a good mouth for the bit, so too skillful educators give us children with a good ear for speech. I'm skipping a bit. And he says here, therefore, a famous adage in antiquity, nature has given us 2 ears and only 1 mouth, because we ought to do less talking than listening. What's nice about this adage in Plutarch, which precedes Plutarch, is quoted in all the medieval commentaries on Pirkei Avot. The 2 I quoted, Duran, and they quote the same adage, saying, HaChachamim omrim. In all cases, then, silence is a safe adornment for the young. But I want to get to the 3 points he says, which are close to Pirkei Avot. But even if the remarks be none too agreeable, put up with them and wait for the speaker to pause. And even when the pause comes, don't at once interpose the objection, but allow an interval to elapse. And he finishes, but those who constantly interrupt with contradictions, they ruin the the lecture. So I end with one paragraph. It is in an instructive essay in a recent collection on silence, edited by Rachel Efrat. Yossi Tzigor enumerated some 10 reasons for the monastic requirement of silence. Beyond teaching discipline and humility, or as a mystical device to achieve unity with God, silence was linked to the art of listening, hearing attentively. Now, here comes a guess. It seems that in Western culture, silence is coupled with thought and thinking. One might, for example, contrast the hush of the library with the din of the Beit Midrash. It remains to be explored whether the Jewish sages also perceive thought as being produced only in verbal exchange, something Platonic, Socratic, or whether there's also thought produced in silence. I can't remember a source of rabbinical literature that portrays a rabbi coming up with with a light bulb over his head with a good idea. I think it's all in exchange and dialogue. All this has to be pursued further. Ta-da.
Okay.